Anyway, I have avoided posting about this just because of how embarrassed I am. But in earning y'all's trust, in showing that I too am human, I am not a robot, accidents are going to be made. Everything structurally sound was perfect, the designs were perfect, but if you guys remember the turtle belt that I made, it was upside down. So the orientation was reversed on what was initially discussed and agreed upon. Originally, the order was made for an old friend. She wanted a custom belt made for her boyfriend. We went back and forth on the design a few times. Everything was great. And unfortunately, I just got a little too confident and careless and made it upside down. So anyway, I insisted that they keep the belt that they already have because she did send me, she's got a little buckle that is a turtle and it looks like it can be worn either way. So hopefully they're using it. Hopefully it's going great. He's got some buckles that are made for the original orientation that was discussed, and this is my error, so I am fixing it for free. Thankfully, I am ever grateful for how patient they've been, and I have honestly just been very stressed about this and have been really wanting to make sure I get it right. And because they've been so patient, wanted to make sure I go the extra mile and put all of the extra little details in that I can. I figured it would be a great opportunity for me to teach you guys and walk you through some of my techniques and how I've learned. Now that's not to say that there aren't a million ways to get the job done. Whatever technique works for you, that's fantastic. I am just here to express what I have found works best for me. And even through the years, it evolves, it changes. I try new techniques, I learn more. I always recommend that you guys go out yourself and try a bunch of different techniques. Always have some scraps on hand. I am a bit of a leather hoarder. I tend to save every scrap that I have. I never know when it's going to come in handy, and it does more than doing woodcraft and having a box of scraps, I'll say. At least in my experience, right? Everybody's experience is going to be different. But anyway, I am here today to walk you guys through how I cut and finish my edges. So, come along for the ride. So, first of all, if you are a child, please ask your parent for help with sharp objects. I'm a professional. I've been doing this. I'm an adult. I am allowed to do this. So anyway, we have our half moon blade. This is a fun one. Very, very sharp. I sharpen it regularly. This one as well. I can't remember the name at the time currently, but it's one of my favorite blades. Handy dandy, trusty, X-Acto knife. That's what, and I wrap mine every now and again, and it's about time to be replaced. This one's getting kind of funky, but just some grip wrap, whatever it's called, for you can buy them for tattoo machines. They're fantastic. I love it for my X-Acto knife. That way, for hours of use, my hands aren't as sore. It's a bit more squishy, not as rigid. So for this exact project, with how straight we need to keep it, this is a fantastic tool. This one is as well, but it's going to create some unevenness. This one we keep rolling at a steady rate. This one can be an option, but it's not exactly one that I would use for this project that I'm currently working on. This is great for fine little details, and again, it can work for this, just not for this project. Lately, I have preferred just using my half moon blade. I'll angle it just a touch so that the underside of the blade is angled farther out, that way giving the stitches a little bit more space, because we can always take it down a little bit more with sanding, which is later on in the process. And then you just roll your blade. My blade is sharp enough I can push it. It's not exactly great for the sharpen, but it's not exactly great for the life of your edge, but and you can just about hear that crunch of leather to know that you've gotten all the way through. And there it releases. And we just work our way down the edge. So now that I've gone through with my half moon knife, I'm going to go through and really fine correct some of these last little bits of edge, where I will take my X-Acto knife and very, very carefully, with a brand new blade, I say brand new blade, but this one I think needs to be switched too. Now with an even newer blade on my X-Acto knife, there we go, and it should just cut like butter. And now it's just very, very fine little bits. And I'm looking to make it flush with that, and I can keep an eye and make sure I'm not coming too close to these. And this way too, I can keep the blade flush with this side of Veg Tan. Now this is a skill that takes time to develop. When starting, you have to be careful that this blade doesn't run on you and down into your project. So it takes a lot of control of learning to balance the blade off of this side of Veg Tan and using the leather to create some stability with itself. And if you have to go over it a few times, just shave off a little bit more. That's all right. Take your time with it. You can always cut more off if you can't add it back. So now on this back side, eventually all of this will be beveled down, but now you can notice there is an unevenness, right, of the width of leather between the stitch. So now we can kind of eyeball. And again, we're just taking little bits off at a time. And we'll have a few more layers of steps that will help even all of this out. From beveling to sanding. But this just helps get it even closer and easier. So for this step, we want damn good, not perfect. Definitely make sure you watch the angle of your blade because you're not looking to bevel this edge just yet. We're still just evening out the 2 layers of Veg Tan. And in order to help yourself not let this blade run, you want to hold a little bit more of the weight towards the back edge of this blade. And it's a balancing act between making sure you've still got some of the material, but not letting it tip and run. Now to move on to the next step. So you can tell I've already gone through and beveled this edge a little bit before I glued it down. So now I'm just going to go through and bevel the backing of it. And this is just an Odin number 5 push beveler. And just make sure you're keeping a consistent angle. And I give it a firm little bit of pressure, but also just let it do its job. And if it's unable to do its own job, that's a little hint to you that you need to sharpen. So sometimes it gets a little jagged, and my stitches are running a little tight, and it bunches up that leather. This one I just have to play with, and you're gonna have to learn what works best for you. And you do have to be careful because this tool can also run on you. And I have dug it through pieces of projects before, so just make sure you're being careful and aware. As always, these are sharp tools that are being used. It'll get sanded, so it'll clean up better, but again, just try and have some consistency. And push come to shove, we can always go back with the X-Acto blade again. And just, again, keep in mind the angle that I'm running. I'm just barely taking the edge off. Keeping a very consistent angle to what is already there. Okay, so this side is already beveled, but again, we can always go through and give it just a little touch up. Okay, so the next step with both of these projects, now that we have trimmed the edges, we've beveled, we've stremeled, now it's time to hand sand, just to take off just tiny little bits. It's a very time-consuming process, but if you stay patient with it, these edges look like glass. And the details, the devil is in the details. So as I go through my layers of grit, I start at a 120, I'll do a 220, then I move on to about a 400, and I'll end with a 600. Now this is done in multiple steps because we have to go through and dye these edges. We don't have to, but for this project I want to. That's the look that I'm going for. And then I go over with some Tokonal and we're going to burnish it, and then we will be done. But for now, with this 120 grit, I just, as you see, I curve it to the edge just a little bit. And it just helps to marry everything together that much better. Now you don't want to overbend it and hit these stitches because that's not good for anybody, but if you want, you can do it a side at a time. So if I pay attention to this front here first, you can go through and at a 45-degree angle, more or less, approximately a 45-degree angle, you can just take little bits off and soften down that beveled edge, right? Or you can flip it to the back. And with this designer calf, I really just like to roll it, because if you just sit here and do this, it'll fray all of the ends. It doesn't really help pull it together much. So here's a little odd wonky spot where it didn't even out. And now's the time you just go in. And there you go. So right now with the 120 grit, I'm not really going to be able to get all of this to be even, but it's going to start and lay a good foundation layer for working up those grits so that we can get all these fine little fine little fibers to lay down and be cohesive. And I'm just flipping it back and forth. This is really just eye checking for spots that I'm feeling nitpicky about. The 120 grit sandpaper is really going to be the last step of eating away a good amount of material before we start escalating up the levels of grit. So this belt is 2 pieces of edge tan, so it's going to sand differently that designer calf. I tend to be a lot more patient and slower with the designer leather, the thinner stuff. But this veg tan gets very cohesive very fast, so there's not going to be much that we have to do in this layer for this belt. So I just barely sand this tip just to round it out just a touch. And for my leather dies, I've always used Phoebes. Super happy with this brand. Again, not sponsored, but would love to be. So for my edges, I just pour some in there. And again, there's a lot of different ways that people like to go about doing this. My preferred method is I take a paintbrush, and notice it's an angled, flat, long bristle and a bit firmer. I just take a little bit on the brush and I start more in the center line, and you can always work your way out. But once this leather dye is in there, there's no taking it back. So be very precise and sure of where you're placing this leather dye. And all those light parts that we just sanded down. And with this leather dye, it does tend to bleed just a touch, so you can always place it just behind where you want it to end and just barely let it run. Again, you can always put more, but you can't take away once it's on there. And if you're feeling uncomfortable with edges, try practicing on this back edge, because that's going to be a lot easier to hide and more people are going to look at this front. So the more errors you make on this front piece, people are going to be able to tell a lot easier. This is just, it's another technique that you've got to play with. You've got to learn what works best for you. And sometimes if I've just re-dipped my paintbrush and there's a lot of dye in there, I will start in the middle and just let it bleed out. And then once there's less in there, but there's still some product, then I'll go through my edges. Okay, so I've gone ahead and gotten the belt done. Now with the guitar strap, because this isn't veg tan on veg tan, because this is a softer piece of leather that has been treated differently, it does take dyes differently. It wants to run just a little bit more than usual. So for this method, I start on the side with the design, and similarly, I do start in the center and work my way towards the edge. But I'm not as worried about hitting this side. Now you shouldn't leave it completely blank, but for the most part that edge will soften and move as we burnish. I am not too worried about it. And just take whatever excess is left on your brush and brush it towards that back edge. Okay, so unfortunately, again, I am not sponsored, but this stuff has been such a game changer. Tokonole, I've used beeswax, I've used glycerin to burnish my edges, and this is what I've had the best luck with. I take an empty bingo dauber, and you can buy them on Amazon. I think I filled with probably that much Tokonole and the rest water. It's fantastic. You can open it and fill it from this side. I always shake it before I use it. And you got a dauber. They come white, but over time, just with the leather dye and whatnot, it does tend to dye it. Okay, so the tools that I use for this, I've got a burnishing stick that has been well loved throughout the years, and just a canvas cloth. You can buy a big pack of canvas on Amazon for relatively cheap. Okay, so now that I've gone through and I've finished slicking it after the 120 grit, I'm going to go through with a 220 grit. And just take that layer off. And you will notice a color change. That's completely normal. It will also show you where the low spots are. And if you need to go back over with the 120 grit, don't be afraid to do that. For example, this little spot, these little spots right here where it's running a little bit lower, I'll take the 120 grit and even it out just because again it eats that material a little bit faster. So it'll be easier, you're not going to be fighting it as much. And we can always switch back to that 220 and smooth it back out. You also want to be aware that you don't want to spend too much time in one spot, otherwise you're going to be making it very uneven. And already 2 layers in, you'll notice a huge difference in the glossiness. And all of those fibers are coming together and laying down. And you'll notice as I work my way through the layers, I don't have to fight it as much to burnish those edges. And you can see just how glossy it is. So just from using that canvas, it doesn't have as much of a sheen, but if I go back over it, and already. So here's just the canvas versus using the wood slicker. In my personal opinion, I think Veg Tan definitely polishes and burnishes up the nicest edge, but I might be a little biased. And I've noticed over time, a lot of people will finish their edges with leather paint, or not leather paint, but edge paint. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do, but in my personal opinion, it doesn't last as long because that edge starts to crack and actually fall off and break away. This is being absorbed into the leather and becoming part of the leather. It's not going, it can't crack off. And as long as you condition and oil your belt over time, it should maintain all of that work we've put in. After doing the math, I think each piece spends about 2 hours going through just the edge finishing process alone. And that's not 2 hours of me flipping between projects. That is 2 hours of work time with this specific project. We've done the 120 grit, the 220 grit. Now you guessed it, 320. And see those little bubbles right there? That little texture, that's what we're trying to smooth out. And if you need to jump down a grit below, do that. Okay, I'm going to jump back down to a 220 really quick because there's this little spot right here, and right here. Just even those out. And I'll go back over with the 320.